The canyon echoes with fanatic cries as torches blaze, hunting an innocent soul. Purify this tainted land. Her evil calls the drought, screams their leader. Elias Stone shields the silent girl, but then the sky unleashes its primal fury. Golden talons strike, revealing a terrifying truth about her connection to the mountain, and what happens next shakes the wilderness to its core. Elias Stone, known among the few who spoke of him as Urso, bore the weight of a world he'd cast off like a tattered coat. His hands, rough as bark, and his spirit, as unyielding as the granite peaks he now called home, were forged in the crucible of solitude. He had witnessed humanity's endless dance of greed and deceit, the petty corruptions that festered in the heart of even the smallest settlements, the clamor of voices, the scent of stale ale and false promises, had driven him deeper and deeper into the wilderness. He sought not merely quietude, but an eradication of all the old marks, a cleansing by the vast, indifferent hand of the West. The Echoing Gorge Ranch was his chosen sanctuary, a place already half claimed by the land itself. Its skeletal beams pierced the sky, a monument to forgotten dreams, nestled precariously between sun-scorched badlands and mountains that scratched at the clouds. Here, the only laws were those of sun and stone, of hunger and survival. Elias moved through its dilapidated structures with a practiced grace, mending what could be mended, accepting what could not. He lived on cured meats, foraged berries, and the occasional game brought down with his steady rifle. His days were measured by the sun's arc, his nights by the vast, star-strewn canvas above. The biting wind that whistled through the canyons was his only companion, a constant, mournful song that mirrored the quiet ache in his own soul. He had come to vanish, to become as much a part of the landscape as the ancient pines and the tireless rivers. It was during one of his solitary explorations, high above the ranch, where the air thinned and the world spread out beneath him like a crumpled map, that he first saw them. Golden eagles, larger and more magnificent than any he had ever observed, soared in wide, deliberate circles. Their movements were not those of hunters scanning for prey, but of sentinels, vigilant and unwavering. Their piercing calls echoed off the canyon walls, not in territorial warning, but with a strange, possessive cadence. A flicker of curiosity, a tiny ember long thought extinguished in his heart, stirred within him. The mountain, he knew, rarely yielded what one expected. It revealed what one needed. He followed their silent guidance, his boots crunching on scree, his senses sharpened by years of living on the edge of danger. He thought of the whispers he had half heard weeks ago, during a brief, unwelcome trip to Dusty Hollow Village for supplies. Whispers of a marked child, a wild thing left to the whims of the wilderness. A tale dismissed by the townsfolk as mere superstition, a macabre fable woven by the desperate isolation of mountain folk. But now, those forgotten words resonated with an unnerving clarity. He reached a hidden alcove, a gash in the living rock, veiled by thorny brush and resilient junipers. The air here was still, charged with an almost palpable energy. And there, amidst the shadows and the scent of pine needles, a slender figure sat. Her eyes, wide and luminous, met his, reflecting the same untamed serenity that shone in the eyes of the golden sentinels now perched on the crags above them, silent and watchful. The solitude he had so carefully cultivated, the world he had so meticulously built to exclude all human contact, shattered in that instant. His sanctuary, he now realized, was not his alone. The sight of her, small and still amidst the rugged grandeur, was a chisel striking the hardened stone of Elias's resolve. He had sought the wilderness to escape the intricate, suffocating ties of humankind, to shed the burdens of expectation and deceit. Now, here was a burden of a different kind, one that stirred an unfamiliar tremor in the desolate landscape of his heart. The golden eagles, silent sentinels on the wind-scoured ledges, watched him with eyes that held the wisdom of ages. their immense wings unmoving against the impossibly blue sky. They did not swoop, did not shriek their territorial defiance. Instead, they observed a strange, knowing acceptance in their gaze that baffled him. Lyra, for that was the name he would later instinctively bestow upon her, remained motionless. Her clothes, faded and tattered, spoke of a long, arduous journey, or perhaps a protracted abandonment. Her skin was kissed by the sun and wind, her hair tangled with the remnants of the wild. Yet there was no fear in her eyes when they met his, only a profound, ancient stillness, as if she had always belonged to the silence of that place. Elias felt the stark, raw reality of her situation settle upon him, heavy as a winter shroud. The whispers from Dusty Hollow Village, those vague tales of a marked child left to the mountain's mercy, now coalesced into a chilling, undeniable truth. This was not a child who had merely strayed. This was a soul cast out, banished to the realm of stone and wind, a sacrifice to superstition or fear. His heart, long accustomed to the unyielding beat of its own solitary rhythm, began to pound with a different urgency. He could walk away. He had come to the canyon for precisely this kind of detachment, to let the world's pain be swallowed by the vast indifference of nature. The chill of the approaching winter, already biting at the edges of the high peaks, was a stark reminder of the mountain's unforgiving embrace. To leave her was to condemn her to a fate that the wilderness would soon claim. Yet, to stay, to interfere, was to invite back the very complications he had fled. It was a crossroads forged in granite and stark necessity, a moment where the man who had abandoned humanity found himself faced with a choice that defined his own. He studied the eagles again, their majestic forms almost blurring into the rock face. Their presence, so protective and unwavering, suggested that Lyra was not simply an unfortunate stray. There was something more profound here, a connection to the raw, ancient spirit of the mountain itself that defied simple explanation. Perhaps she was not lost at all, but intrinsically linked to this untamed power, a living embodiment of the wilderness's fierce, enigmatic heart. The eagles, he realized, were not merely guarding a child, they were guarding time's their own asterisk, and in their silent acceptance of his presence, he sensed an unasked question, a challenge to his own humanity. It was as if the mountain itself was demanding an accounting. A shift occurred within him then, subtle yet irreversible. The silence of the peaks, once a comfort, now felt like a heavy accusation. He could no longer simply exist in his self-imposed exile, not when faced with such raw vulnerability, such profound injustice. He knew the mountain's harsh beauty, its brutal lessons, but he also knew its hidden pockets of resilience, the unexpected warmth found in a sheltered hollow. He would not, could not, allow the wild to claim this fragile life without a fight. His path, which he believed had led him to utter solitude, was now undeniably converging with another. With a resolve as solid as the rock beneath his feet, Elias took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. He moved not with the urgency of rescue, but with the quiet reverence of a man entering a sacred, dangerous space. He was crossing a threshold, not just into the girl's guarded world, but into a future he had never envisioned. A future where his own hardened solitude might finally crack and yield to something profoundly new. The wind carried his scent, the eagles watched, and the girl, Lyra, remained still, her steady gaze the only compass in this uncharted territory of his soul. His old life, the one he thought he had buried, now lay irrevocably behind him. Elias had not spoken a single word, for he knew they shared no common tongue. Instead, he had communicated through patient, measured gestures, slowly extending a hand, offering a piece of cured venison. Lyra's eyes, bright and wary, had tracked his every move, her small fingers eventually taking the meat with the swiftness of a wild creature. The eagles, still perched high above, seemed to observe this silent transaction with an ancient understanding. He had led her then, not with force, but with the quiet promise of shelter against the encroaching chill. She followed, a shadow flitting between rocks, never quite at ease, yet drawn by a necessity stronger than her apprehension. The journey down to the Echoing Gorge Ranch was a silent testament to the vast chasm between their worlds. Elias was a man of the mountain, but of human making. Lyra was the mountain's own, a child of its breath and stone. He offered his hand over a tricky crevice, and she stared at it, then navigated the obstacle herself with a dexterity that shamed his years of experience. He knew then that she was not helpless, merely unacquainted with the conventions of his kind. When they finally reached the dilapidated ranch, the scent of wood smoke from his small, meticulously maintained cabin drifted on the crisp air. It was a beacon, a stark contrast to the elemental harshness of her recent existence. The cabin itself, a sturdy but rough-hewn structure, had been Elias's fortress against the world. Every plank, every nail, every carefully laid stone in the hearth had been placed with the intention of keeping humanity out. Now, a fragile, wild-eyed girl stood on its threshold, a living embodiment of the outside world he had so fiercely rejected. He felt a tremor, not of fear, but of profound unease. His ordered solitude, his carefully constructed peace, was about to be irrevocably altered. He had always seen himself as a guardian of silence, a sentinel against intrusion. Now, he was the intruder, bringing an unknown force into his sanctum. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, the creak echoing in the sudden quiet. Inside, the single room was Spartan, yet held the warmth of a constant fire. Pelts adorned the floor, tools hung neatly from pegs, and a stack of worn books lay beside his rough-hewn bed. It was a man's world, stark and functional. Lyra hesitated, her gaze sweeping over the unfamiliar objects, her senses likely overwhelmed by the concentrated human scent, the enclosed space. The mountain man watched her, his expression unreadable, a battle waging within him. Part of him yearned for the return of his solitude, for the simple, uncomplicated rhythm of his former days. Another, deeper part, recognized the desperate vulnerability in her gaze, the echo of his own past abandonment, though his had been self-imposed. He gestured towards a corner, where a bedroll lay, a thick bearskin folded at its foot. It was an offering, a silent proposition of temporary shelter. She did not move towards it immediately. Instead, her eyes were drawn to a small, hand-carved wooden eagle perched on his mantelpiece, a relic from his own forgotten youth, a token from a time before he had shed his name and sought the wild. It was a crude thing, yet it held a spark of recognition in her gaze, a subtle softening of her features. It was as if this simple carving, a mere likeness, bridged the vast gap between her world and his, a silent acknowledgement of the shared spirit of the high places. A thread, ancient and unseen, seemed to pull taut between them, suggesting that their meeting was not mere chance, but a convergence of paths long foretold by the very mountains that watched over them. Elias knew then that this was no fleeting encounter. The mountain, through its silent guardians, had entrusted her to him. But the mountain's gifts always came with a price, a reciprocal demand. He could offer her warmth, food, and protection from the coming frost and the encroaching dangers of the human world. But his sanctuary was not a charity, and the wild, which had raised her, still demanded a measure of effort, a respect for its unyielding rules. He would give her refuge, yes, but not without understanding. He would allow her to stay, to share his meager existence, but she would have to learn to navigate his world as he had to navigate hers. His gaze, steady and unflinching, met hers, conveying a silent covenant. This was a place of survival, not solace, and its bounty, however sparse, must be earned, respected, and defended. Her presence here would require something of her, just as it already demanded everything from him. The initial days at Echoing Gorge were a delicate dance of unfamiliarity and silent observation. Elias returned to his routines, felling timber with powerful, rhythmic swings of his axe, tending snares, and ensuring the cabin's defenses against the encroaching winter. Lyra, a spectral presence, moved with a quiet grace that belied her youth. She was a creature of instinct, her senses finely tuned to the subtle language of the wilderness. She would sit by the hearth, watching the flames dance, or venture just beyond the cabin's perimeter, her eyes scanning the horizon, perhaps seeking the familiar silhouettes of her winged guardians. Elias offered her tools, simple tasks, but she often seemed to know what was needed before he spoke. She understood the unspoken rhythms of the homestead, the delicate balance between effort and reward that dictated survival in the high country. She brought an unexpected order to the small, rough cabin. Elias, for all his methodical efficiency, had always prioritized function over form. His home was a shelter, a workshop, a place to rest. But Lyra, with no prompting, began to arrange the few scattered items with a careful precision. She gathered the dried herbs he had hanging and bound them neatly, swept the hearth with a spruce branch, and even, to his surprise, began to mend a tear in his bearskin blanket with deft, quick movements, using sinew and a bone needle. It was a silent, almost invisible transformation. But the cabin, once merely a shelter, began to soften, to exhale a breath of quiet domesticity it had never known. The sterile scent of pine and smoke started to mingle with something warmer, something that spoke of lived-in comfort. One frigid morning, Elias awoke to the faint aroma of freshly baked bread. Lyra, having discovered a small bag of flour and his simple iron pan, had managed to conjure a rough but warm loaf over the coals. It was not merely food, it was an act of creation, a subtle assertion of her inherent ability to nurture, to bring warmth and life to a place that had long known only the austere hand of necessity. Elias, who had subsisted on hardtack and cured meat for years, found a strange, unexpected comfort in the simple offering. He saw then that her value was not in wielding an axe or tracking game, but in a different, equally vital strength, a resilience of spirit, a quiet resourcefulness that could transform the raw elements of survival into something akin to home. She was not a burden, she was a catalyst. The mountain man, accustomed to the silence of his own thoughts, found himself observing her with a growing sense of wonder. Her knowledge of the mountain, though different from his own, was profound. She knew which berries were safe, which roots offered sustenance, and often, without a sound, she would point to the distant flight of an eagle, indicating game that Elias had not yet sensed. His initial apprehension, the quiet resistance to her presence, began to melt like snow under the spring sun. She was not just a survivor, she was a silent artisan of life, weaving threads of comfort and warmth into the stark tapestry of his existence. The cabin, once a fortress against humanity, was subtly shifting, slowly becoming something more. It was no longer just his, it was becoming theirs. Yet this fragile peace, this blossoming warmth, was always overshadowed by the looming winter and the distant, ever-present threat of the human world. Elias knew that the tranquility they had found was a fragile thing, easily shattered. One evening, as the first heavy snowfall blanketed the canyon in an ethereal silence, a distant, unnatural sound carried on the wind, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot, too close for comfort, too deliberate to be merely a hunter's stray bullet. It was a discordant note in the mountain symphony, a harsh reminder that the world he had fled was always lurking at the fringes, and its gaze, he feared, was now fixed upon his remote sanctuary. The warmth of the hearth and the gentle presence of Lyra suddenly felt incredibly vulnerable against the encroaching darkness. The rifle shot, sharp and alien in the pristine silence of the newly fallen snow, had been a harbinger. Elias knew the sound too well. It spoke not of hunting, but of something more sinister, something that sought not game, but trouble. He had seen its like in the valley towns, where disputes were settled with lead and anger, and peace was a luxury for the privileged. Now, that venomous breath seemed to have found its way to his sanctuary. Lyra, her head snapping up at the sound, her eyes wide with an ancient apprehension, looked at him with an unspoken question, a vulnerability that pierced through his hardened exterior. The following days were marked by a tense vigilance. Elias patrolled the perimeter of the ranch, his rifle always within reach, his senses attuned to every whisper of the wind, every snap of a twig. He knew that winter, while providing a protective cloak of snow, also left tracks, clear and undeniable. He found them eventually, boot prints, heavy and numerous, heading not directly towards the ranch, but skirting the upper ridges of the canyon. They belonged to men, not animals, and their trajectory suggested a methodical search, a deliberate intent. These were not lost travelers. These were hunters, and Elias knew with a cold certainty that he and Lyra were their quarry. The superstition from Dusty Hollow, the fear of the marked child, had finally found its teeth. Then came the blizzard, a churning maelstrom of snow and wind that descended upon the canyon with an almost biblical fury. It was a storm unlike any Elias had weathered in his years on the mountain, a whiteout that swallowed the world, blurring the line between earth and sky. He had stocked the cabin well, but the raw power of the storm tested even his seasoned resolve. The temperature plummeted, and the wind shrieked like a banshee through the chimney. He worried for the game, for the very survival of the mountain's creatures, and most acutely, for the unseen figures he knew were still out there, stalking. It was during the third day of the relentless storm that Lyra disappeared. Elias, battling the wind to secure a loose shutter, turned back to find her corner empty. A primal fear, cold and sharp, seized him. He had seen the anxiety in her eyes, the way she would look towards the peaks as if pulled by an invisible thread. He knew, with a dreadful certainty, that she had gone in search of her winged guardians, perhaps sensing their distress, or merely seeking the familiarity of the high, wind-swept places that had once been her only home. He strapped on his snowshoes, grabbed his rifle, and plunged into the white abyss. The blizzard howled, tearing at his clothes, blinding him with swirling snow. He called her name, the sound swallowed by the wind, his voice raw with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. Hours blurred into an eternity of brutal effort. He followed faint tracks, barely visible beneath the relentless fall, his mind racing, conjuring images of her small form lost to the unforgiving cold. He finally found her, huddled in a snowdrift near the highest ridge, barely conscious, her skin a shocking blue, but miraculously still breathing. And there, circling low through the swirling snow, battling the gale-force winds with astonishing determination, were two golden eagles, their calls a desperate, mournful cry. They were trying to guide him, to protect her even against the mountain's fury, but the storm was too great. He carried her back, a silent, desperate trek through the heart of the tempest. He stoked the fire to a roaring blaze, wrapped her in every available blanket, and spent the night watching over her, feeding her warm broth, willing the life back into her fragile body. As the dawn finally broke, revealing a world blanketed in serene, unimaginable white, Lyra awoke, her eyes clear, a spark of gratitude in their depths. Elias, exhausted but relieved, felt a truth settle within him, a revelation more profound than any external discovery. He had fled from the world to avoid the pain of human connection, the vulnerability of love and loss. But in the harrowing depths of the blizzard, saving Lyra, he had found his truest self. Later, as the snow began to melt, revealing the scars of the storm, Elias found himself sharing stories he had long kept buried. He spoke of the family he had lost, the betrayal that had driven him into the wilderness, the hollow ache that had become his constant companion. Lyra, though she spoke no words, he understood, listened with an intuitive wisdom, her eyes reflecting a profound empathy. And in turn, through gestures and soft, guttural sounds, she conveyed her own tale of being left behind, a child deemed different, an outcast, abandoned to the judgment of the wild. They were two broken halves, each fleeing a different kind of wound, now finding solace in their shared vulnerability. The shocking truth was not a secret revealed about an enemy, but the raw, unveiled truth of their own hearts, laid bare in the quiet intimacy of their newfound sanctuary. But just as their bond solidified, a new, unsettling silence fell over the canyon. The heavy boot prints Elias had found weeks ago were now joined by new ones, fresher, more numerous. They led directly to the ranch. The storm had hidden them, had given them a temporary reprieve, but the hunters had not given up. As Elias gazed out at the newly cleared valley, a line of dark figures emerged from the tree line, led by a man on horseback, his silhouette stark against the white expanse. Their presence was a stark, undeniable challenge, not just to his peace, but to the very existence of the fragile family he had forged. His sanctuary, his peace, and Lyra's very life were now on a precipice. The confrontation had been averted, at least for a moment. The line of men, so stark and threatening against the snow, had paused at the canyon's entrance, their expressions a mix of suspicion and unease. Elias, rifle held ready, his stance rooted like an ancient tree, had met their gaze with an unyielding determination that spoke more than words ever could. For now, they had retreated, their unspoken threat hanging heavy in the crisp mountain air. But he knew they would return. The kindling of fear and superstition in Dusty Hollow had been fanned into a flame, and it would not easily be extinguished. In the uneasy calm that followed, a deeper connection began to forge between Elias and Lyra. The shared ordeal of the blizzard, the raw confessions of their past wounds, had stripped away the last remnants of their solitude. They moved through their days with a quiet synchronicity, a dance of two souls finally finding their rhythm together. Elias taught her the names of the tools, the purpose of each trap, the subtle signs of changing weather. Lyra, in turn, showed him how to identify forgotten edible plants beneath the snow, how to coax warmth from damp kindling, and how to read the nuanced signals of the mountain's creatures. She would often hum soft, wordless melodies, ancient tunes that seemed to echo the very pulse of the earth, and Elias found himself listening, a profound peace settling over his restless spirit. He learned of her past not through spoken words, but through the universal language of memory and emotion. She would trace symbols in the dust by the fire, a crude drawing of a family, then a single, weeping figure, followed by the image of soaring eagles. She had been cast out, deemed an ill omen by her village, a marked child, whose very existence was believed to invite misfortune. The eagles, her first and most loyal guardians, had been both her protectors and her only companions in the wilderness. Elias saw in her story the harsh hand of human judgment, the brutal ignorance that demonizes what it cannot understand. He recognized the pain, the profound sense of otherness, because he had carried it himself. One evening, as the fire crackled and the wind sighed gently outside, Lyra discovered a small, intricately carved bird nestled amongst Elias's few cherished possessions, an eagle. Its wings spread as if in flight. Her eyes, usually so serene, widened in surprise and recognition. Elias had carved it himself as a boy, a tribute to the soaring raptors he had always admired, a symbol of freedom and resilience. But Lyra, with soft, tentative gestures, showed him a similar carving, barely visible on a smooth, weathered stone she had carried with her for years. It was an older, more primitive carving of an eagle, almost identical in its spirit, though different in execution. Her ancestors, she conveyed through the stone, had also honored the eagles, believed them to be sacred guardians. It was a profound moment, a revelation that transcended mere coincidence. Their paths, it seemed, had not merely converged by chance on this isolated peak. They were intertwined, echoing through generations, connected by a shared reverence for the mountain's winged protectors. Elias had sought refuge here to escape his past, only to find that his past, in a sense, had led him to Lyra, to a connection that felt as ancient and immutable as the mountains themselves. Their bond was not just born of shared trauma and mutual protection, but of a deeper, almost predestined kinship. They were two pariahs, each an echo of the other, finally finding their true home. Yet, this newfound tranquility, this deepening sense of belonging, was a fragile thing, built upon the shifting sands of external threats. As the snow began its slow retreat, revealing the first brave shoots of spring, so too did the outside world make its undeniable return. One afternoon, as Elias worked on the cabin's roof, he heard Lyra cry out from the valley floor. He scrambled down, his heart seizing with dread. She pointed, her finger trembling, towards the farthest edge of the canyon. There, silhouetted against the setting sun, a plume of smoke rose into the sky, not from a natural fire, but from a human settlement, burning fiercely. And in the distance, carried on the chilling evening breeze, was the faint, unmistakable sound of approaching horses, their hooves striking the earth with a rhythmic urgency that spoke of many riders and a purpose far from benign. The peace was shattered. Their fragile sanctuary was no longer safe. The plume of smoke, a dark stain against the twilight sky, was a stark herald of the danger's return. The rhythmic thud of horses' hooves grew louder, carrying with it the stench of fear and the bitter taste of human malice. Elias, his heart a drum against his ribs, knew the flimsy peace they had built was over. The men from Dusty Hollow, inflamed by their superstitions and led by the fanatical preacher Albright, had finally made their move. They hadn't merely come to investigate. They had come to reclaim what they believed was theirs, to purify the wilderness of what they considered an abomination. He gathered Lyra, his gaze sweeping over the canyon with fierce resolve. This was no longer about his solitude. It was about her survival. He had sought the mountain to escape conflict, but now conflict had found him, and his role as a protector had cemented itself within his very soul. He secured the cabin, checked his rifle, and prepared for the inevitable. The night passed in a tense vigil, punctuated by the mournful hoot of an owl and the distant, unseen movements of their pursuers. By dawn, the mountain pass leading to the echoing gorge was choked with men. Their shouts, coarse and angry, echoed off the canyon walls, shattering the pristine silence Elias had cherished. They were armed with torches, pitchforks, and an unholy fervor, convinced that Lyra's presence had cursed their crops and tainted their lives. Preacher Albright, a gaunt figure whose eyes burned with righteous madness, rode at the front, his voice booming condemnations against the wild sorceress and the demon-haunted man who harbored her. Elias positioned himself at the narrowest point of the canyon's entrance, his figure a silhouette of unyielding granite. He held his rifle, but his true weapon was the unwavering resolve in his eyes. He would not allow them to pass. Lyra, hidden within the thicket of pines above, watched, her own heart pounding with a mixture of terror and fierce loyalty. The golden eagles, her ancient protectors, circled high above, their calls sharp and warning. As Preacher Albright spurred his horse forward, his words a torrent of fire and brimstone, Elias remained silent, his gaze fixed, unwavering. He was no longer Elias Stone, the man who fled. He was the mountain man, the guardian of this sacred, wild place, and of the fragile soul entrusted to his care. The preacher, mistaking Elias's stoicism for fear, pressed on, convinced that the power of his conviction would break the lone man. But then, a new voice joined the cacophony. From among Albright's own men, a grizzled old prospector named Silas stepped forward, his face etched with worry. Silas had been one of the few who had treated Elias with a modicum of respect in Dusty Hollow, and he had witnessed the preacher's growing fanaticism with unease. He now spoke, his voice surprisingly firm amidst the chaos, urging caution, reminding the men of the harshness of winter, the value of the mountain man's knowledge, and questioning the certainty of the preacher's accusations. He spoke not of defending Lyra, but of the dangerous folly of provoking a man who knew the mountain's wrath intimately. This unexpected descent caused a momentary ripple of doubt among some of the townsfolk. They glanced at each other, then back at the formidable figure of Elias, his presence as solid as the canyon walls. Preacher Albright, however, saw only further defiance. He raised his torch, his face contorted in a sneer, and urged his men forward, intent on sweeping aside all resistance. He believed that the mountain man and the marked child represented a challenge not just to his authority, but to the very order of their world. He would not be swayed by reason or doubt. Seeing the futility of holding them back by force alone, Elias made a desperate, calculated decision. He stepped forward, lowering his rifle, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the preacher's harangue. He would give himself up, he declared, allow them to take him, but only if they promised to leave the girl and the ranch in peace. It was a bluff, a desperate gamble, but one that exposed the true nature of their malice. They didn't want justice. They wanted a scapegoat. As he spoke, a chilling thought settled in his mind, a revelation that deepened the stakes. The preacher and his followers weren't just seeking to cleanse the canyon, they aimed to claim it, to seize the rich resources that lay hidden in its depths, knowing that Elias and Lyra were the only obstacles. His sacrifice, he now understood, would not save her, but merely clear the path for their true, greedy intentions. As he finished speaking, ready to face whatever terrible fate awaited him, a sudden, piercing shriek ripped through the air, silencing the men below. A shadow, vast and dark, fell across the canyon floor. High above, the golden eagles, a dozen strong, not merely Lyra's two loyal protectors, but an entire flock, plunged from the sky, their wings beating a furious rhythm, their talons glinting like daggers in the morning sun. They swooped and cried, not at Elias, but directly at the advancing men, their fury a living extension of the mountain's own rage. Elias had offered a sacrifice, but the mountain, it seemed, had already chosen its champions. The air above Echoing Gorge became a maelstrom of beating wings and piercing shrieks. The golden eagles, magnificent and terrifying, descended like a tempest, their formidable talons flashing in the weak morning light. They did not strike to kill, but to intimidate, to dismantle the resolve of the encroaching men with a primal, untamed fury. Horses reared, whinnying in panic, their riders struggling to maintain control. The men, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion, stumbled backward, their torches flickering wildly as the great bird swept past, so close they could feel the wind from their wings. Preacher Albright, his voice now a desperate croak, tried to rally his flock, but his words were drowned out by the avian onslaught. Elias, still standing resolute at the canyon's choke point, watched the chaos unfold, his rifle now forgotten. This was not his fight alone. It was the mountain's answer, a raw, elemental force rising to protect its own. Lyra, emerging from her hiding place, stood beside him, her gaze fixed on her majestic guardians, a quiet triumph in her eyes. The eagles were not just her protectors, they were extensions of her very spirit, the wild heart of the canyon made manifest. Amidst the swirling feathers and panicked cries, old Silas, the dissenting prospector, seized the moment. He began to shout, not at Elias, but at the other townsmen, reminding them of the true nature of their expedition. He pointed to the gold panning equipment some of the men carried, equipment meant not for cleansing, but for prospecting. He spoke of the preacher's greed, his ambition to claim the canyon's rumored riches, using Lyra's supposed curse as a pretext. His words, though barely audible over the eagle's cries, struck a chord of recognition and resentment among the less zealous members of the group. They had been manipulated, their fear exploited for another man's gain. Preacher Albright, realizing his true motives were being exposed, turned his fury on Silas, attempting to silence him. But before he could act, a sudden, powerful gust of wind seeming to coalesce from the very heart of the canyon, tore at the preacher's coat, ripping it from his body and sending it fluttering into the chasm below. As the coat, revealing the shiny, brass glint of a hidden gold nugget sewn into its lining, disappeared into the abyss, the last vestiges of Albright's authority crumbled. The men, now witnessing both the mountain's wrath and the preacher's duplicity, began to waver. The eagles, sensing the shift, made one final, terrifying pass. They swooped low, their wings brushing the men's heads, their cries echoing like the judgments of an ancient god. It was too much. The townsfolk, already shaken by the unexpected aerial assault and Silas's revelations, broke ranks. They turned and fled, a disordered mob, their fear of the wild spirits of the mountain and of the man who stood as their protector, far outweighing their fear of the preacher or their hunger for gold. Albright, abandoned and exposed, stood alone for a moment, his face a mask of defeat and rage, before he too turned and scrambled away, leaving behind his broken ambitions and the tattered remnants of his authority. Elias and Lyra watched them go, their forms receding into the distance, shrinking against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the mountain. The canyon fell silent once more, save for the soft beating of the eagle's wings as they returned to their high perches, their watch fulfilled. The threat was repelled, the immediate danger past. But the silence that followed was not merely the return of peace, it was the quiet aftermath of a battle, a reminder that the world outside would always harbor its shadows. As Elias looked at Lyra, a profound sense of gratitude and belonging settled over him. They had faced the storm together, and together they had prevailed. Yet, as the last faint echo of the retreating men's horses faded, he knew that the mountain, while offering refuge, would forever test their strength, demanding constant vigilance against the encroaching greed and ignorance of humanity. Their victory was a testament to their bond, but the future, as always, remained a vast and uncharted wilderness. A year had spun itself into the intricate tapestry of the mountains since the men from Dusty Hollow had fled, their fear a greater weapon than any rifle. The canyon, once a place of tense vigilance, now hummed with a quiet, vibrant life. The echoing Gorge Ranch, no longer a forgotten relic, had been painstakingly transformed. Elias, his hands still rough with labor, moved with a newfound lightness in his step, no longer just a hermit seeking oblivion, but a man tending his home, his family. The cabin, once stark, was now infused with the subtle warmth of Lyra's touch. Colorful wildflowers, gathered from the high meadows, adorned the rough-hewn table, and the scent of freshly baked bread was a constant, comforting presence. Lyra, no longer a silent phantom, had blossomed. Though her words remained few, her laughter, bright and clear, now often echoed across the valley. She moved with an easy grace, tending a small garden, weaving baskets from willow branches, her connection to the wild deepening rather than diminishing within the walls of their home. The golden eagles still soared above, their cries now a familiar, reassuring melody, an integral part of the canyon's symphony. They were family, too, their presence a constant reminder of the day they had descended like avenging angels to defend their own. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves began their fiery descent, Elias watched Lyra from the cabin doorway. She sat by the sun-drenched stream, her hands moving deftly over a piece of tanned hide, crafting a soft pouch. The morning sun illuminated her profile, revealing a gentle curve beneath the homespun fabric of her dress, the undeniable sign of new life. She was visibly pregnant, her condition a living testament to the complete healing that had taken root in the remote wilderness, a profound symbol of the future they were building together. The man who had once believed his lineage had ended with him now carried the sacred hope of a new beginning, a continuity forged in the crucible of love and survival. Later that day, as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, Lyra showed Elias a small, smooth river stone she had found. Etched into its surface, though barely visible with age, were familiar symbols, an eagle in flight, and beneath it, a stylized human figure with outstretched arms. It was an ancient image, almost identical to the eagle carving Elias had cherished since childhood and to the one Lyra had carried with her for years. She conveyed, with a quiet solemnity, that this stone had been found near an old, almost forgotten spring, a place her people had revered for generations, believing it to be a sacred site where the spirit of the mountain communed with humankind. The discovery was a revelation, a final, beautiful piece of their intertwined destiny. Their connection to the eagles, to this specific canyon, was not a mere coincidence or shared affinity. It was an ancient lineage, a predestined bond woven into the very fabric of the land. Elias had not merely found a refuge, he had returned to a heritage, to a place where his own spirit and Lyra's were destined to flourish, rooted in the deep, mystical history of the mountains. He was not just protecting a found family, he was upholding an ancient covenant. The Echoing Gorge Ranch, once a place of abandonment and solitude, had become a vibrant heart, beating with the rhythms of life, love, and legacy. Elias Urso Stone, the man who had fled humanity, had discovered that his true strength lay not in isolation, but in the fierce, unyielding protection of those he loved. He had learned that home was not a place built with wood and stone, but a feeling forged in shared sacrifice, in the quiet wisdom of understanding, and in the unwavering belief that family was not always found in blood, but in the souls chosen by the heart. The mountains, silent and grand, would forever bear witness to their story, a timeless saga whispered on the wind, that even in the harshest wilderness, amidst the wild cries of eagles, love could bloom, and from two lost souls, a new world could begin. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us from what corner of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment, and to make sure you don't miss the next adventure, subscribe to the channel.